I'll have like 2 of each lesson. If you missed one and you want one, I'll do my best. If you ask me for one, I try to do my best to remember, print it off one, bring it with me. If I don't, you'll have to bear with me on that. But I'll try to write it down and make sure I bring them with. No one asked me today, but I've had a couple of people ask for previous handouts. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll get started this morning. Our Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for all you've done for us. We do thank you for the great heritage we have with our Baptist history here. And Lord, I pray to help us as we study it, Lord, to gain a greater understanding of it, and Lord, to be more founded in our faith. And Lord, I pray you bless our time together this whole day in church, Sunday school hour, and Lord, also the church service in the afternoon. I pray that you would be with our time together. Lord, I pray you'd speak to our hearts, and that our hearts would be good soil, that the seed of the Word of God would be able to grow and bear fruit in our lives. I pray bless our time together. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're actually, you'll notice on the slide, I have an ocean, and that is not me paddle boarding in the background. I have no idea who that is. However, we are jumping across the pond this morning. We'll finish up Baptist history in Europe and in England, and everything history-wise ended in 1776 when the United States of America became a country. History really started then. I'm just kidding. But we're going to start coming over to the United States of America, or the New World as it was called at that point. And so we'll finish up in England, some Baptist history in England, and then we'll be moving over to Baptist history in America. And you can see on your handout there, it's split up into 2 different sections. The year 1641 is remembered as the year of liberty for the Baptists in England. Up until this point, it was difficult to be a Baptist. You were persecuted if you were a Baptist. There's a man named William Laud. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. I alluded to him last week. He was not a good person, especially if you were a Baptist. He was not a good person. And under Charles I, he would hunt out Baptists, try to get rid of them, try to make laws, try to just, as best as he could, persecute them into becoming part of the Church of England. Remember, the Church of England was started by what king? Henry VIII, right? And the King of England, or the Queen of England, the monarch, is the head of the Church of England. Even to this day, the monarch in England is the head of the Church of England. I think they've tried to separate themselves a little bit from it, but they're still recognized as the head of the Church of England. You have the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope is the head of that church. The Church of England, the English monarch is the head of that church. So, of course, in this time, in the 1600s, the 1700s, when the kings or the queens have absolute authority, if you were not recognizing the authority of the Church of England, whose authority really weren't you recognizing? The authority of the monarch. So it was treason, and there was many laws passed about it. William Laud was impeached for treason in 1641, interestingly enough, and Parliament disbanded the High Commission Court of the Star Chamber. Sounds like some weird conspiracy theory, but it actually was there. The High Commission Court was established by William Laud to basically imprison Baptists or non-Church of England conformists. It was disbanded in 1641. The year that it was disbanded became a year of religious freedom for the Baptists, but technically they were legally free. So the fight's over, everything's wonderful, we're all legally free, right? 1641, everything's wonderful. Unfortunately, in 1641, there was a civil war in England. This is not the American Civil War, it's the English Civil War. And up until this point in English history, I think I mentioned it last week as well. Immersion baptism was the mode of baptism for the Church of England. In fact, it was illegal to baptize in England any other way. You had to immerse baptism. There was laws that you had to immerse baptize. Well, great. They're all Baptists? No. They were baptizing for the wrong reason. However, it was against the law to baptize any other way. Well, the Civil War, 1641, they overthrew everything that was in authority in England, as typically happens in a civil war. And the Church of England, along with the monarch, was overthrown, and the Presbyterians stepped in to take over authority in the Church of England. And the Presbyterians were not for immersion baptism, and it was around 1640, sometime between 1641 and 1648, the Presbyterians changed the mode of baptism in the Church of England to sprinkling instead of immersion. And in 1648, they passed a law. It actually was passed in 1645, but it didn't take effect. In other words, they didn't punish people for it, for breaking it, until 1648. They passed a law requiring pouring or sprinkling baptism. So like complete 180, they went from you have to immerse baptize to pouring or sprinkling. That came into effect in 1648, and it came along with a law to punish those who baptized by immersion. So you had to baptize by sprinkling or pouring, effusion, or you were punished for immerse baptism. Who comes up with, if you don't baptize the way we want you to baptize, we're going to punish you? But this is what was going on in England in the 1640s. Thomas Collier, he was a prominent Baptist evangelist in England in the 1640s. He connected Anabaptist to baptized Christians. He talked a lot about how they've made this mistake of just calling everyone who immersed baptized Anabaptists. There was more than just Anabaptists that immersed baptized. He actually was a pastor, and he refused to pay tithes to the Church of England branch that was in his area that he was supposed to pay tithe to. He was against it, obviously didn't agree with the Church of England. He refused. He was persecuted. He wrote several books, actually. Thomas Lamb was another English Baptist. He was a well-known Baptist pastor. He was jailed under this law and only released if he promised not to preach and baptize or attend any Baptist church. They said you can't preach, you can't baptize, and you're not allowed to attend a Baptist church. Of course, what church do you think they wanted him to attend? Church of England. He wasn't allowed to preach there either or baptize. So they said you can get out. They let him out on bond. He didn't have to pay money to get out. He just had to promise, I'm not going to preach, baptize, or attend a Baptist church. He was released in June, and by October, old habits die hard. He was reported to be preaching and baptizing. He was persecuted as well. There are some other prominent Baptists in England. It was during this time, the 1640s, the idea of association and conventions among particular and general Baptist churches came to be. Some of them, these are over in England, or were, the Lincolnshire Association, the Midland Association, and the General Assembly. So the idea of an association, now how many have ever heard of the Southern Baptist Convention? The American Baptist Convention. So in the United States, we tend to have conventions as opposed to associations. And it was a little after this, that in the United States, the idea of an association was one where the association had more authority, almost like a governing body. And of course, in the United States of America, we were freedom-loving people, and we didn't want this overlording association. So the term convention was used, and the idea of a convention was one of more of a, it wasn't really a governing body as much as an association was. So you see that difference there? You see a lot of associations over in England, and in the New World, you see a lot of conventions. And most of that was due to we want to be independent churches. We don't need a governing body. You will see associations in the United States of America. We'll talk about many of them, but most of them are very, very loosely governed associations. In England, they liked a strong government, which is okay as long as it's protecting human rights and not trying to take them away. They were for that, so they came up with these associations. These are some of the big name associations in England during that time. Among the particular Baptists, they were more popular. There was more desire for them. A lot of it was written into their constitution, their church constitutions, to have associations, to have a governing body that keep everyone on the same track. And among the General Baptists, it wasn't as popular. However, the General Baptists were the first Baptists to have associations in England, and the Particular Baptists followed along. What's the difference between Particular and General Baptists? We talked about it last week. Remember? A little bit. Did I talk about it last week? All right, so a General Baptist is more of a Baptist that we would recognize with, where the gospel is for everyone. A Particular Baptist would be a Baptist who would say the gospel is for a particular group of people, hence the term particular. They tend to follow the teachings of John Calvin. Probably we would call them Reformed Baptists today. Might be a more modern term to call them. Reformed theologists. However, they were called Particular and General Baptists. This is about the time when really you start to see them rising. At this point in history, there was more General Baptists than there were Particular Baptists in England. There was 6 Particular Baptist churches that were followed John Calvin's theology, where the gospel is only for a particular group of people, in the terms of John Calvin, the elect, right? As opposed to General Baptists, the gospel is for everyone. Everyone can get saved. Jesus died for everyone. So that's the difference between Particular and General Baptists. As well, so I encourage you, if you pay attention to when you're looking up churches, and if you do that, when you're on vacation, not going to our church, out of town. Hopefully you're going to our church if you're in town. But if you're out of town, you're looking for a church to go to, and you look them up, and they have the London Baptist Confession. That's a Particular Baptist confession. The Particular Baptists came up with that. So if they have on their website, we follow the London Baptist Confession or the London Confession of Faith, they're probably going to be particular in their theology, where their thinking is that Jesus Christ died for only the elect, and everyone else is created for damnation in hell, which is basically what they believe. So out of those associations, this is all where all of these things started from, came the confessions and the creeds, such as the London Confession. Very famous. You will see that referenced in church constitutions. And I think it's a little dangerous to say, here's the work, the writings of a man that we hold to, and we're going to follow the writings of this man. I don't believe we have the London Confession in our Constitution. We follow the Bible. Shock, right? Baptists were still persecuted during and after the Civil War. Wait, I thought 1641 was the year of liberty. Well, you remember it wasn't that long after they passed a law against immersion baptism, which is basically against Baptists. How many have ever heard of John Bunyan? Okay. Anyone know what book John Bunyan dreamed up while he was in prison? Pilgrim's Progress. I think it's still true that Pilgrim's Progress, next to the Bible, is the most read book in the world up until this point. I don't think there's another one. I don't know if that statistic has changed. But as far as I know, it's like the second most read book in the world apart from the Bible. John Bunyan, of course, he was a Baptist preacher. He was put into jail for preaching and really for denying infant baptism. That was his big crime. Babies should not be baptized. Put the guy in jail, right? John Milton is a little less well known than John Bunyan. Have you ever heard of John Milton? He was a poet. He's pretty famous as an English literature guy. He wrote a lot of poetry. He was also a Baptist. However, it's a little bit harder to find history on him being a Baptist than it is for John Bunyan. At the end of his life, John Milton would not say that he was a Baptist, but he also would not say that he was anything else. I think he was just kind of tired of organized religion at that point in his life in any way, shape, or form. He started out, I believe, as a Presbyterian. He became a Baptist, and then at the end of his life, he was like, I'm done with it all. However, if you dug into what he really believed, he was definitely against infant baptism. He was against sprinkling, baptizing anyone. He was for independent churches. He actually said he professed that his form, or the form for his system, was from the Bible. He didn't go to any man's writing. He didn't go to any man's leadership. He said, I'm going to read the Bible and find out from the Bible the way that I should believe and practice in my life. So John Milton was another famous person who was imprisoned because of his beliefs about baptism and what he said about baptism. The Toleration Act of 1689 gave the Baptists more freedom, but they were still restrained by the state. So there's a Toleration Act there that was passed. It gave the Baptists more freedom. However, it wasn't total religious freedom. It said that the religious freedom was built by the blood of Baptists. Not just freedom for Baptists, but freedom for all religions in England was built by the blood of Baptists because the Baptists were the ones who were fighting for that religious freedom, pressing for it, being persecuted for it. Andrew Fuller was another well-known Baptist pastor in 1783. How many have ever heard of Andrew Fuller? How many have ever heard of William Carey? Okay. The father, I believe we call him the father of modern missions, right? William Carey was greatly influenced by a man named Andrew Fuller. I believe the number is 330 million people were reached in some way, shape, or form by William Carey. 330 million as a missionary. He translated the Bible. They said he had such an incredible gift to learn languages. William Carey. He translated the Bible into like 4,000 different languages while he was on the mission field. It may be more. Just an incredible person. To this day, if you go to some of those countries that he worked in, they use his work from translation for their languages. So this guy's had a massive impact on the world, even to this day. But the man that helped him and was his friend, kind of helped him to get started, was Andrew Fuller. In 1783, he preached to a congregation that included William Carey. Andrew Fuller started out of his church there in Kettering, I believe is how you say it. He started the Baptist Missionary, or the Baptist Mission Society, in 1792, and that would send out missionaries. They would collect money to send out missionaries to all of the world, and really it was through the work of Andrew Fuller that missions would begin in earnest from Baptist churches there in England. He wrote a book. He was actually very opposed to error in theology, theological error, and he was very strongly against Calvinism. He wrote a book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation. You kind of see where he's going with that. Another man, how many have ever heard of Robert Raikes? Ever heard of Robert Raikes in world history? He's called the father of the Sunday school movement, Robert Raikes is. However, so what was going on is children would work 6 days a week. You didn't work on Sunday. And the children that were poor enough that they had to work didn't get to go to school. So a man named Robert Raikes decided that on their day off, he would offer for free education to these children who could not attend school on weekdays because they were working. So Robert Raikes started the Sunday school, and it actually was a school that taught, writing, reading, all of that, those studies like regular school. And he actually paid teachers to teach on Sunday those children who could not go to school during regular school days. However, by the way, how many of you have ever taught Sunday school at our church? Did you ever get paid for it? Okay, Pastor Peter, when he was the assistant pastor, got paid to be a Sunday school teacher. I'm not being paid to be a Sunday school teacher. The idea is based on a voluntary position, right? You volunteer, or you're asked to volunteer, or you're voluntold, however you want to say it, right? To be a Sunday school teacher. That was not Robert Raikes' design. It was a man named Fox, was his last name. I wrote his name down, William Fox. He was a deacon, not a pastor. He was a deacon in a Baptist church in England, and he looked at Robert Raikes' model of a Sunday school, and he said, this is a good idea. However, they're not educating them in the Bible. So William Fox organized the Sunday School Society out of his Baptist church there, based on volunteer teachers. He didn't pay them. They volunteered to teach the Bible to children to make sure they got a good education when it came to the Bible. The Sunday school, and it's largely kind of has fallen away at this point in history, but the whole idea of Sunday school that we think of and that a lot of the world thinks of, where you have a Bible teaching going on, teaching time in a church, that all came from a Baptist deacon who said, hey, we need to make sure that people have an understanding of the Scriptures, so we're going to teach them on Sunday mornings in a free setting with volunteer teachers to teach the Bible. I think that's pretty cool, that the idea of a Sunday school, really, that if you talk to someone about Sunday school, they're not thinking of a education time as far as math and reading and writing and literature and history. They're thinking of Bible-based education. That all came from a man named William Fox, who started the Sunday School Society. Some other famous English Baptist pastors. I have to include these because if I leave them out, someone's going to be like, hey, what about this guy? Robert Hall was a famous English Baptist. We're getting pretty far ahead of ourselves in English history, or in Baptist history here. But Charles Spurgeon, you ever heard of Charles Spurgeon? He was a Baptist, and Alexander Maclaren as well. Those are some famous English Baptist pastors. Now we're going to go back in time. We're going to get on the Mayflower and cross the Atlantic Ocean in 1620 with the Pilgrims. Everyone okay with that? Coming to the New World. By 1646, so the Mayflower with the Pilgrims came over to the New World at what date? 1620, right? So by 1646, 26 years later, it's an official record by Governor Winslow of Baptists being present at Plymouth. He wasn't writing like, hooray, they're here. He was just saying, there's Baptists here, right? At Plymouth. Were the Pilgrims Baptists? Anyone have an answer for that? Were they or were they not? Do we want to claim them as Baptists? We would like to, but they're not. As far as I know, and in my opinion, they were not Baptists. They were not Church of England. They didn't really call themselves anything. In fact, what did they call themselves? Pilgrims, the separatists, right? So remember on the Mayflower, you had the two groups of people, the strangers and the separatists, okay? They called themselves separatists. Why? They wanted to separate from the Church of England. They wanted to get away from it. They tried to go to Holland. It didn't work out because Holland wasn't really the place they felt like God was leading them to be. By the way, the Pilgrims didn't hate England. They didn't hate their country. They loved their country. And it hurt them deeply to have to flee from England. But they had to for religious freedom. I think there's a great example there. It's not for us to hate the country that God's allowed us to be a part of, right? And to just be unkind and, say all sorts of evil things about it. We should try our best to live here as long as we possibly can. I don't know where we're going to go to from here. Heaven, right? Maybe Antarctica if they allow us to. But as far as I know, I don't know where else you'd flee to from here. I believe we have a great nation. I'm still proud to be an American. But we should be careful not to disparage the country that God has allowed us to be a part of as Christians, right? The Pilgrims didn't hate England. They loved England. But they had to flee. 1620, they came over here. As far as I can tell by history, they were not Baptist. In fact, they baptized like the Church of England. They sprinkle baptized. They poured baptism. The Baptists were allowed to be a part of Plymouth Plantation or the colony Plymouth as long as they were quiet. Do you think that worked out very well for the Baptists? They started protesting infant baptism in church by when an infant was being baptized, they would stand up and face away from the baptism. So they weren't being quiet. It's like, hey, you guys are welcome as long as you're quiet, but this is not being quiet. So they were not allowed to be a part of that. How many have ever heard of Roger Williams? Roger Williams is a pretty famous character in American history. He's a pretty famous character in Baptist history as well. A little point here, I think this is interesting because we're in New Hampshire. It is not known if Hansard Noley was a Baptist. This is on your handout. There's no official record where he said, I'm a Baptist. However, it is possible that he was the first Baptist pastor in America. He had a church. They immersion baptized, which is different than the typical mode of baptism in the New World at this time. He did pastor a church in Piscataqua, New Hampshire, which is over by the Dover area, Dover, New Hampshire. He pastored a church there briefly before returning to England. He was called an Anabaptist, a godly Anabaptist. I think that's kind of interesting that it's possible that the first Baptist pastor may have pastored a Baptist church in New Hampshire. And as best as I can, I'm going to claim that the first Baptist pastor was in New Hampshire. There's no record of Baptists being in Providence until about 100 years after Roger Williams was there. 1633, Roger Williams was a bad guy. He wanted freedom of religion. He wanted, big thing, separation of church and state. In Plymouth, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is Boston basically, they had a church state, much like the Church of England, although it was more of a congregational form of church. And eventually the Congregationalist church would become the church state, or the state church. You had to go to church. Your taxes went to pay for church things, like the pastor's salary. Your tithe, you were forced to tithe to a Baptist church. It was a state-established religion in these colonies, Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Eventually, Plymouth would be absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony as well. Roger Williams came. He was dismissed from Boston. He actually went to Plymouth, to Boston. He was dismissed. He went back to Plymouth. They allowed him to be in Plymouth for a short time. Eventually, he was dismissed from Plymouth, and several of his followers were dismissed as well. We know Roger Williams went to Rhode Island. He started what town in Rhode Island? It's a little small, tiny town. Providence, Rhode Island, right? He started that. Was Roger Williams a Baptist? At this point, I don't believe he was a Baptist when he was dismissed or banished from the colony. He was not a Baptist as far as I can tell. However, he did become a Baptist. When he got to Rhode Island, there's records that he was baptized as a Baptist, and he started the church there in Rhode Island. The congregation at Scituate is known for immersion baptism. Again, it's illegal to be anything but a congregational church in the New World. Were they putting out a sign that said, we're a Baptist church? Hello, we're a Baptist church meeting illegally? No, however, it's known that they were there. There's records of them being there. So the congregation at Scituate was known for immersion baptism. Its third pastor, Henry Dunster, was the first president of Harvard. You ever heard of this little school called Harvard? He was the president, the first president of Harvard. I believe it was, his name's not up there. I have his name written down. Obadiah Holmes. You ever heard of Obadiah Holmes? He watched Obadiah Holmes being persecuted, I believe is the story, and was like, wait, why are they whipping this man? And came to the conclusion, as he studied it out, that immersion baptism was the correct mode of baptism. Came out and said that, and because of that, he was forced to resign as the president of Harvard, but he was the third pastor of that church in Scituate. Hansard Knollys, we talked about him. He pastored a church in Piscataqua, which is around Dover, that area, on 1638, so that's pretty early on in American history. He was called a godly Anabaptist. In Massachusetts, again, right, we don't have all the Baptists are saying we're Baptists because it was illegal, but these men, 6 men, were fined by the General Court of Massachusetts in 1639 for trying to start a Baptist church in Weymouth, Massachusetts. So they said, hey, we're writing a record that we're fining these men for trying to start a Baptist church in Massachusetts. So there's no record of a Baptist church in Providence until about 100 years, back to your handout, after Roger Williams was baptized there. Was there a Baptist church? Most likely there was. If it was a church there, it was most likely Baptistic in its belief. We know that Roger Williams immersion baptized. By 1750, there is a record of 55 Baptist churches in the colonies. But none of those churches, those 55 churches, claim to be related to the Baptist church in Providence. So it's not like Roger Williams, the point, I guess, is it's not like Roger Williams went to Providence, Rhode Island, and every Baptist church in America came from Providence, Rhode Island. There were other Baptists in the New World before and during Roger Williams with his church there in Providence, Rhode Island. you'll see a lot of times in history he was the first Baptist in America. There were Baptists here before him. There were Baptists here with him, or the same time that he was here. Did he do a great thing? I would say that the greatest thing that Roger Williams, the idea that he brought to the New World, was this idea of separation of church and state. I would say that would be the greatest idea or gift, if you want to call it that he gave to the New World, was this seed that he planted that the church and the state should be separate. There's no church-run state, and there's no state-run church. Providence, Rhode Island colony provided a great concept of religious freedom and separation of church and state. November 1644, the General Court passed a law stating any person who denies infant baptism would be banished from the colony. Does this sound like England? Right, they came here, they said we want religious freedom, and that was 1620. And 1644, 24 years later, it's the same exact law in England that they set up here in the colonies. If you denied infant baptism, you'd be banished from the colony. Roger Williams was invited to pastor a church in Salem. He was prevented from doing so by Governor Bradford. Ever heard of Governor Bradford? By the way, I'm not against the Pilgrims. I'm not against Governor Bradford. I think what they did, what they established, the spirit that they brought with them to the New World was wonderful. However, in terms of religious freedom, separation of church and state, I would have to say they were a little lacking because they set up a church state. And they banished people for not agreeing or not attending their church. Roger Williams returned to Salem with several followers from Plymouth, where he was finally banished in 1636, one reason being he demanded the separation of church and state. He traveled to Providence with 5 others in 1636. Once in Providence, Roger Williams and Ezekiel Holman baptized each other by immersion. So he baptized this guy, the other guy baptized him. However, there's no record of a Baptist church in Providence until 100 years later. There's 55 Baptist churches in 1750. None of them claim to have originated from Providence. And as I said, the greatest gift that I would say from Providence, Rhode Island, came this idea of separation of church and state. The Baptist church in Swansea is the first Baptist church that was recorded in 1663. It was founded by a Welsh pastor named John Miles. He came over and established that church. You're going to see that term Welsh in Baptist history pop up a lot as we move forward. There were a lot of Baptists in Ireland, and they would flee persecution, and fleeing they would come to the New World seeking religious freedom. So there's a lot of, we owe a lot of our Baptist heritage to the Baptists of Ireland. It's pretty interesting. He was one of those men that was fleeing persecution. Of course, we know that Ireland was a Catholic nation at this point in history, and it still has Catholicism there. It was in Northern Ireland, of course, was with England, but Ireland was a Catholic nation. They were run by the Catholic Church. So they would flee persecution. One of those people was John Miles. The first Baptist church recorded in Massachusetts was at Swansea. Like, this is an actual Baptist church, right? He founded 3 Baptist churches in Massachusetts. Another man named John Clark, he started a Baptist church in Newport, Rhode Island, around 1640. John Clark was friends with another man named John Crandall and Obadiah Holmes. So we're kind of like following one guy, then going back, following another guy. I hope it's not too confusing. So John Clark, Obadiah Holmes, and John Crandall, they were invited to a meeting to preach in Lynn, Massachusetts. And while there, they were arrested. and they could pay the fine and get out of jail. All three of them refused to pay the fine for preaching and for believing against infant baptism. John Clark and John Crandall, they were released. It's not Han, it's John. They were released from jail because someone else paid the fine for them. However, Obadiah Holmes' fine was not paid, and he was publicly whipped. He was a Baptist who was whipped for being a Baptist in the New World. This is not that long after the Pilgrims, fleeing religious persecution, came to the New World, and here we are persecuting people because of what they believe. Didn't take that long to get there, did it? Unfortunately, this would continue until after we fought and won the Revolutionary War, or the American War for Independence. And it would continue after that, and it would continue even after the Constitution that we currently have in effect was ratified, and it would continue until the Bill of Rights was put into place. And even after that, it took several years for states to phase out their state churches. Yes? A lot of them were coming for economic reasons. So yes. So even in the Mayflower, you have the strangers. They weren't coming over here for religious freedom. They were coming over here for economic reasons. You have the whole colony of Jamestown. They came over here to find gold. They thought it was going to be just laying everywhere. Fortunately, it wasn't, and most of them didn't make out very well, right? But yeah, a lot of people came to the New World seeking that, the riches and wealth that they thought were going to be promised here, or were promised but weren't. So yeah, a lot of them could have come over with this idea, this mentality of a church state, and been promoted to those positions and set up those things. However, even in Plymouth, they were all pilgrims, separatists who were put into those positions, the governors, and they still set up that state church. So let's see, where were we? Obadiah Holmes, he was whipped. In Virginia, it was strictly forbidden for anyone to be members, for anything but members of the Church of England. So you had to be a member of the Church of England. In 1775, what happened in 1776? The Declaration of Independence, right? 1775, due to religious freedom in England, the Baptists enjoyed religious liberty. So we were still under English law. Because of that, we had to allow, to a certain extent, religious liberty because of what was going on in England. So due to the religious freedom in England, Baptists enjoyed some religious liberty. In 1786, how many years after the War for Independence was that? Do some math. 20 years? 10 years, right? 10 years after the American War for Independence, we finally said, okay, you can be Baptist and you can be religiously free in the United States of America. We'll go back and study out a little bit more of this, but we're just kind of an overall view of Baptists in the New World. We'll look at it a little more closely, but basically an overall view. It wasn't until 1786 in the United States of America that you could be a Baptist without really fearing imprisonment and persecution of some sort, having to pay a fine, one or the other. That wasn't until around 1786, and in some states it would continue a little bit longer. Massachusetts hung on to their state church for a long time, and there was people who were persecuted in Massachusetts for being a Baptist after the Constitution was ratified. Pretty interesting history. Any comments, questions, input before we end? Yes, Howard. Rhode Island was not they didn't have a state church. Yep. So Rhode Island, how many of you know what the smallest state in the Union is? Okay, you know why? Because Connecticut and Massachusetts despised their no state religion, and they took territory from Rhode Island, trying to scare them into establishing the state church. That's part of Baptist history. Pretty interesting. We'll talk about that when we talk about Rhode Island. But yeah, that's a lot of the reasons why it's the smallest state in the Union, because they were for separation of church and state. But they didn't have a state church there in Rhode Island. Anything else? Marvelous. It's 9:47. You are dismissed.